On June 4th, 2025, Israel published what it called a complete after-action review of its April intercept operations against Iranian ballistic missiles. The document was 14 pages. It included trajectory data, intercept altitudes, radar cross-section estimates, and engagement timelines down to the second. The Israeli Ministry of Defense distributed it to 3 allied defense ministries and posted a summarized version to a public-facing briefing portal. Within 6 hours, Iranian state media quoted from it. Not to mock it, not to deny it, to thank it. I want you to hold on to that word, thank, because what I am about to show you over the next 27 minutes is that Israel just handed Iran the single most valuable piece of operational intelligence Tehran has sought for over a decade, and it did so voluntarily, publicly, and with pride. And the reason no one in Washington is talking about this is because they still believe air defense transparency is a form of deterrence. It is not. It is a targeting manual. Here is the thesis of this video. Iran did not need to test America's Gulf architecture by launching against it. It needed someone to publish how that architecture performs under load. Israel just did that. And the data Iran extracted is not about Israel. It is about the one gap in America's layered defense posture between the Strait of Hormuz and the Fifth Fleet's operating box south of Bahrain. That is what this video is about. Now let me reframe the question, because the question you are hearing in every Western defense commentary right now is the wrong question. The question they are asking is, did Israel's intercept rate prove the effectiveness of Allied missile defense? That is the question CNN is asking. That is the question the Atlantic Council is asking. That is the question the Pentagon wants Congress to ask, because the answer is yes, and yes feels like safety. Here is the right question. If you publish exactly how your defense system performs, what its engagement ceiling is, what its minimum intercept altitude is, how many simultaneous tracks it can prosecute, and at what range its discrimination algorithms begin to fail, what have you given to an adversary who was never trying to overwhelm your defense? What have you given to an adversary who was trying to find the one seam in a 2,000-kilometer integrated architecture? You have given them a seam finder. You have given them a map of your confidence, which is the same thing as a map of your assumptions, which is the same thing as a map of your blind spots. That is the reframe. This is not a story about Israeli transparency. This is a story about how the Western theory of deterrence through disclosure has become, in the Iranian strategic calculus, deterrence against yourself. Because disclosure tells your enemy where you believe you are strong, and where you believe you are strong is precisely where you have stopped looking. Let me teach you the framework, because there is a formal name for what just happened, and once you understand it, you will see it everywhere in American defense posture, not just in the Gulf, but in the Western Pacific, in Eastern Europe, and in every theater where Washington believes that showing its hand is the same as winning the game. The framework is called the Lanchester Disclosure Paradox, and it comes from a revision of Lanchester's original attrition models by a group of operational researchers at RAND in the late 1990s. The original Lanchester model tells you that in force-on-force attrition, the larger force wins disproportionately because combat power scales with the square of numbers. But the revised model adds a variable, information asymmetry, and what it shows is that when the stronger force discloses its performance parameters, believing this will deter the weaker force from engaging, it actually does something else entirely. It allows the weaker force to shift from an attrition strategy to a disruption strategy. The weaker force no longer needs to win the engagement. It needs to find the single node where the disclosed system underperforms relative to its stated confidence. Here is why this matters right now. Israel's after-action data included 3 categories of information. First, intercept engagement envelopes, meaning the altitude bands and velocity windows in which Arrow 3, Arrow 2, and David's Sling achieved successful kills. Second, saturation thresholds, meaning the number of simultaneous inbound objects beyond which the system shifted from track while scan to prioritized engagement, effectively meaning it began choosing which threats to ignore. Third, discrimination lag, meaning the time between initial radar detection and confirmed warhead versus decoy classification. Now here is the thing no one in the Western press is saying. America's Gulf architecture, the Aegis ships, the THAAD batteries in the UAE, the Patriot systems in Qatar and Bahrain, all of these systems share fundamental radar and engagement doctrine with the Israeli layered system. They are not identical, but they operate within the same doctrinal family. They share software heritage. They share detection philosophy, they share discrimination logic, and most importantly, they share the same assumption about where the threat comes from. That assumption is that the primary threat axis in the Gulf is ballistic, high altitude, high velocity, radar bright. That is what the entire architecture was designed to intercept. That is what the Israeli data confirms it is good at intercepting. And that is precisely why the Israeli disclosure is so dangerous. Because Iran now has numerical confirmation that the architecture performs well against the threat it was designed for, which means Iran now knows, with published evidence, that the architecture was never optimized for the threat it was not designed for. And that threat is low-altitude, subsonic, sea-skimming cruise missiles launched in coordinated salvos from commercial pattern vessels inside the Gulf itself. Not from Iranian territory, not on a ballistic arc, not from 1,000 kilometers away. From 40 nautical miles at 15 meters above the waterline, with a radar cross-section smaller than a seabird, arriving at the Aegis radar horizon with less than 22 seconds of tracking time before impact. Hold on to that number, 22 seconds. Because what the Israeli data just confirmed for Iran is that the discrimination lag in the Allied system, the time between detection and warhead classification, is between 8 and 14 seconds in the ballistic domain where the system excels. That leaves a comfortable engagement window against ballistic targets. But when you transpose that discrimination lag into the sea-skimming domain, where detection range is collapsed by the radar horizon, 8 to 14 seconds of classification time inside a 22-second total window means the engagement window is not comfortable. It is between 8 and 14 seconds. For a system that requires track confirmation, fire solution computation, and interceptor flight time. These two numbers cannot both be true and also safe. Either the system has time to classify and engage, or it does not. And what the Israeli data tells Iran, without Iran ever needing to launch a single test against the Gulf architecture, is that the answer depends entirely on threat axis. Come from above, and the system works. Come from the surface, and the system is in a race it may not win. Let me walk you through the evidence now, step by step, because I want you to understand that Iran did not stumble onto this insight by accident. It has been engineering toward exactly this scenario for 7 years. And the Israeli disclosure simply confirmed that the engineering was correct. Evidence point 1. In 2018, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy conducted a series of exercises in the Strait of Hormuz using what Western intelligence initially classified as commercial dhow conversions, small wooden-hulled vessels modified to carry 2 to 4 cruise missiles each. The Pentagon assessed these as harassment platforms, not serious strike assets. The assessment was based on the assumption that cruise missiles launched from such platforms would be unguided or poorly targeted. That assessment has since been revised quietly in a 2023 DIA update that acknowledged Iranian integration of Chinese-derived terminal guidance seekers into their Sumar and Hoveza cruise missile variants. But the revision never reached the public conversation. Evidence point 2. Between 2021 and 2024, Iran conducted at least 9 known tests of sea-launched cruise missiles from platforms that mimicked commercial traffic patterns. These tests were observed by satellite, but not by Gulf radar networks until the missiles were airborne. In 4 of the 9 observed cases, the launch was detected only after the missile had traveled more than 30 kilometers from the launch vessel. I want you to hold on to that. Detection after 30 kilometers of flight, from a launch point that was already inside the Gulf. Evidence point 3. In January 2025, the IRGC Navy publicly commissioned what it called the Shahid Soleimani Flotilla, described in Iranian state media as a distributed maritime strike capability. Western analysts focused on the naming. They focused on the propaganda value. Almost no Western outlet reported the operational specification buried in the commissioning ceremony transcript, that the flotilla's stated mission is prosecution of anti-access operations within the radar shadow of Allied surface combatants. Radar shadow. They said it publicly. And no one connected it to what the Israeli data would later confirm about discrimination lag. Evidence point 4. In March 2025, a classified simulation conducted at Naval War College, subsequently reported in summary form by Defense One, modeled a scenario in which Iranian cruise missiles were launched from inside Gulf commercial shipping lanes at ranges under 60 nautical miles from a carrier strike group. The simulation's reported conclusion was that existing Aegis engagement protocols required modification for what the report called compressed timeline threats. I want you to understand what compressed timeline threats means. It means the system does not have enough seconds between detection and impact to guarantee engagement. It means the architecture has a temporal gap. And that gap exists not because the system is bad, but because it was designed for a different geometry. Evidence point 5. After Israel published its after-action data on June 4th, Iranian Defense Commentary, within hours, published a technical analysis in Farsi on the Tasnim news agency's military affairs portal. That analysis did not discuss Israel. It discussed what the analysis called the confirmed engagement window doctrine of Allied integrated air defense, and it concluded, in print, that the doctrine assumes a minimum of 45 seconds between detection and required intercept for ballistic threats, but that this assumption collapses to under 20 seconds for sea-skimming profiles inside restricted waterways. They published this openly after reading the Israeli document. Now let me escalate. Because the 5 evidence points I just walked you through describe a tactical problem. But the tactical problem is not the real story. The real story is what this means for America's entire Gulf posture, and by extension, for the credibility of extended deterrence in the region. Here is the second-order implication. If Iran can credibly threaten to strike American naval assets inside the Gulf using a method that the disclosed architecture is not optimized to defeat, then the Fifth Fleet's operating position becomes a liability rather than an asset. It means that forward deployment, which has been the cornerstone of American Gulf strategy since 1987, is no longer automatically a source of deterrent strength. It becomes a hostage. Because a carrier strike group that cannot guarantee its own local defense against a 22-second threat is not projecting power. It is absorbing risk. And here is where the Lanchester disclosure paradox completes itself. By publishing its performance data, Israel confirmed to Iran that the Allied system is optimized for a threat Iran is not planning to use. Iran is not planning to throw 300 ballistic missiles at a carrier. That would be expensive, detectable, and largely interceptable. Instead, Iran is planning to use 40 cruise missiles from 20 commercial pattern platforms already inside the Gulf, already inside the radar shadow, already inside the compressed engagement window. And the cost asymmetry is catastrophic. A single Hovizah cruise missile costs Iran approximately $300,000 to produce. A single SM-6 interceptor, assuming it even gets a valid firing solution in under 22 seconds, costs the United States $4.3 million. If Iran launches 40 missiles from dispersed platforms, and the Aegis system can engage perhaps 15 to 20 in the available window, the remaining 20 to 25 arrive. The cost to Iran for a salvo that potentially damages or mission kills a $13 billion carrier, $12 million. The cost to America in interceptors alone for partial defense, $65 to $85 million, before a single ship is scratched. Now multiply that by the political calculus. If Iran can demonstrate even once that it can put a cruise missile into the flight deck of an American carrier, the entire regional deterrence architecture does not just weaken, it inverts. Because deterrence works only if the defender's posture appears impregnable. The moment it appears vulnerable, every regional actor recalculates. Saudi Arabia recalculates. The UAE recalculates. Bahrain recalculates. And the recalculation is not military. It is diplomatic. It is, why am I hosting American bases if those bases cannot protect themselves? That is the cascading effect. That is the second-order problem. And it was made possible not by an Iranian weapons test, not by a breakthrough in missile technology, not by a spy operation inside the Pentagon. It was made possible by an ally publishing exactly how its defense works and an adversary reading it correctly. Let me give you the historical parallel, because this has happened before. In 1982, during the Falklands War, the British Royal Navy lost the HMS Sheffield to an Exocet missile. The Exocet was a sea-skimming cruise missile launched from an Argentine super-étendard at low altitude. The Sheffield's air defense system, Sea Dart, was designed for high-altitude engagement. It never acquired the Exocet. The missile struck the ship at approximately 10 meters above the waterline. The subsequent British inquiry concluded that the loss was not due to system failure, but to doctrinal mismatch. The system worked. It worked against the wrong threat. That is exactly the scenario Iran is engineering in the Gulf today, except Iran has something Argentina never had. Iran has the defender's own published performance data confirming the doctrinal mismatch. Now here is your watch list. Here is what I want you to track over the next 30 to 90 days. Number 1. Watch for any change in Fifth Fleet operating posture south of Bahrain. If the carrier strike group begins spending more time outside the Gulf proper, in the Arabian Sea rather than inside the Strait of Hormuz, that tells you the Navy has recognized the compressed timeline threat and is creating standoff distance. That is a defensive concession disguised as routine rotation. Number 2. watch for procurement announcements related to what the Navy calls the counter-cruise missile mission in littoral environments. If you see accelerated funding for CRAM, ESSM Block 2, or directed energy close-in systems, that tells you the Navy is trying to close the 22-second gap with point defense layers rather than area defense. Number 3. Watch for Iranian naval exercises that specifically feature small vessel distributed launch scenarios inside confined waterways. If those exercises increase in frequency or scale over the next 60 days, it tells you Iran is operationalizing, not merely theorizing. Number 4. Read the next Israeli defense publication carefully. If future after-action reports suddenly omit engagement timelines and discrimination lag data, that tells you someone in the alliance finally understood what the first disclosure cost them. Number 5. Track Tasnim News Agency's military analysis portal. If Iranian analysts begin publishing specific engagement window calculations for Gulf scenarios using the parameters from the Israeli document, that tells you the data has been fully absorbed into Iranian operational planning, not merely propaganda. Here's your homework. Go read the 2023 Congressional Research Service report titled Navy Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense Program. Find the section on engagement timeline assumptions. Compare those assumptions to the publicly known flight time of a sea-skimming cruise missile across 40 nautical miles. Do the math yourself. Then ask yourself whether the architecture you are paying for was designed for the war Iran is actually planning to fight. I will leave you with a question I cannot yet answer. If the entire Western theory of deterrence through transparency was built on the assumption that adversaries would be deterred by knowing how strong you are, what happens when the adversary is not trying to match your strength? What happens when the adversary is trying to find the one geometry where your strength does not apply? And what happens when you, yourself, publish the map that shows them exactly where that geometry is? That is the question no one in Washington is asking. I will see you in the next one.